Mrs. Margaret Dawson had lived in the small town of Fairfield, Ohio, her entire life. Her house was the kind that people slowed down to look at when they passed by, the kind with wide porches, tall windows, and ivy creeping up the side of its Victorian structure. It stood as a monument of another era, built when families were large and neighbors close. Now, only she occupied its cavernous rooms. The echoes of footsteps that once belonged to her late husband, Henry, and the laughter of guests who used to gather in the parlor, were only memories. For 5 years since Henry's passing, Margaret had lived in silence. Though she had the means to travel or keep herself occupied with clubs and activities, she found herself tethered to the house. Every evening, when the sun dipped below the horizon, she would sit by her rose garden, wrapped in a shawl, gazing at the street beyond her white picket fence. Her roses were immaculate, the one thing she still tended with passion, and neighbors often commented on their beauty. But to Margaret, they were less about beauty and more about company, silent companions in her loneliness. Children from the neighborhood sometimes played in the street nearby, though rarely close enough to disturb her. Margaret would watch them from her porch, amused by their games of chase, the sound of basketballs bouncing on driveways, or the whir of bicycles rushing by. She never invited them in, nor did she often speak with them, though occasionally she would smile or wave when their eyes caught hers. It was enough to feel part of something without being directly involved, like a spectator on the edge of life. On one particularly crisp autumn evening, the leaves burning red and gold in the trees, Margaret noticed something unusual. A boy stood very still near her fence, unlike the other children who ran and shouted. He was thin, too thin, with hair that looked as if it hadn't been brushed in weeks, and a jacket that seemed one size too small. His shoes were worn down at the soles, his jeans frayed at the knees. But what struck Margaret most wasn't his clothes, it was his eyes. He was watching her roses with such intensity, his gaze filled with longing. Margaret's first thought was that the boy might try to steal a rose. She had caught children doing it before, though she never scolded them. Roses, after all, were meant to be admired. But as she leaned forward for a closer look, she realized his attention wasn't on the flowers themselves. His gaze lifted slowly to her, and for a moment, Margaret froze. Her heart gave a sharp tug in her chest. Those eyes, that face, that particular curve of his smile. It was as though she were looking at a photograph of her husband, Henry, when he was a boy. Margaret blinked hard, shaking her head to clear the image. Surely it was just her mind playing tricks on her. Grief, even after years, had a way of distorting the present. But when she looked again, the boy was still there, his gaze unwavering. Something about his posture, the tilt of his head, even the dimple in his cheek when he half smiled, it all mirrored Henry's childhood photographs she kept in a box upstairs. Her breath caught in her throat. "He looks exactly like my husband who passed," she whispered aloud, the words escaping before she could stop them. The boy didn't move closer. He simply stood there, quiet, almost shy, as though unsure whether he was welcome or trespassing. Margaret studied him more carefully now. His skin was pale, his cheeks hollow, and there was a certain weariness in his stance that no child should carry. Her maternal instinct stirred, an instinct she had never truly fulfilled since she and Henry had not been blessed with children. She felt both a rush of protectiveness and an eerie sense of destiny, as if this moment had been designed to reach into the loneliness of her heart. Finally, she spoke, her voice gentle but firm enough to carry across the fence. "Hello there," she called out. The boy startled slightly, glancing around as if unsure she had meant him. "Yes, you," Margaret clarified, rising slowly from her chair. "What's your name?" He hesitated, eyes darting down to the ground. "Jacob," he said softly after a pause, his voice thin like a thread of sound carried by the wind. The name lodged itself in her chest, unfamiliar yet strangely significant. "Jacob," she repeated, "that's a strong name. Do you live nearby?" He nodded but did not elaborate. Margaret stepped closer to the fence, careful not to startle him further. She noticed how tightly he held his jacket closed with both hands, as though shielding himself from more than just the autumn chill. "Are you hungry?" she asked instinctively, reading the hollowness in his expression. His lips parted slightly, but he didn't answer. She thought she saw a flicker of longing cross his face before he looked away, embarrassed. Margaret felt her heart ache. Hunger was a language she could recognize without words. She considered inviting him in that very moment, but something in his guarded stance told her to move slowly. Children who carried such weariness often carried stories too heavy to share easily. Instead, she offered him a small smile, softening her tone. "I was just about to make some hot cocoa," she lied gently, improvising. "It's far too chilly for an evening like this. Would you like a cup?" Jacob's eyes flickered back to hers, wide and uncertain. For a moment, Margaret thought he might run. But instead, he nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if surrendering to a need greater than his pride. Margaret opened the gate and beckoned him in. His steps were tentative, cautious, like a stray animal uncertain if it could trust the hand that fed it. She noticed his shoes again, the soles flapping slightly with each step, and she swallowed the lump in her throat. When he crossed the threshold of her garden, she felt a strange surge of emotion, as though her world, once sealed by grief, had cracked open just enough to let in the light of something unexpected. She guided him toward the porch, her voice calm, her movements deliberate, wanting him to feel safe. Inside, the warmth of the house seemed to wrap around Jacob immediately. Margaret led him to the kitchen, a space she rarely used except for simple meals. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon from the potpourri she kept in a dish by the window. She set about preparing cocoa, placing the kettle on the stove, her hands surprisingly steady despite the storm of feelings inside her. Jacob sat at the table, small hands folded together, eyes darting curiously around the room. He seemed both odd and uneasy, as though he had stepped into a world entirely different from his own. Margaret glanced at him from the stove, her heart heavy with questions she dared not ask too soon. Where were his parents? Why did he look so thin, so neglected? And why, above all, did he resemble Henry so strongly that it rattled her to her core? She poured the cocoa into a mug, added a generous dollop of whipped cream, and placed it before him. His eyes widened at the sight, and for the first time since she had seen him, his face lit up with genuine joy. He lifted the cup carefully, sipping slowly, savoring each taste as if it were treasure. Watching him, Margaret felt something stir inside her that had been dormant for years. The sight of his fragile gratitude, the simple pleasure he took in warmth and sweetness, filled her with both sorrow and hope. She thought of Henry, of the boy he had once been, the man he had grown into, and the empty space his absence had carved into her life. Now here was Jacob, sitting at her table, bridging past and present in a way she could not explain. She knew this was not chance. Somehow, in ways beyond her understanding, this meeting was meant to be. The cocoa was gone in minutes, though Jacob sipped it as slowly as he could, stretching the moment like it was a rare gift. Margaret noticed how he held the cup with both hands, almost reverently, as if it might vanish if he let go. When he finished, he set it down carefully, his eyes dropping as though embarrassed by how quickly he had consumed it. Margaret reached across the table and patted his small hand lightly. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked. Jacob hesitated, then nodded with the faintest smile, his hunger speaking louder than his words. She rose and began to prepare a simple sandwich, slicing fresh bread, layering turkey and cheese, and adding a side of apple slices. She hadn't cooked for anyone in years, and the act itself felt almost ceremonial. When she placed the plate before him, Jacob's eyes widened again. He picked up the sandwich, biting cautiously at first, then more eagerly, as though he had been starving for days. Margaret pretended to busy herself with tidying the counter, giving him the dignity of eating without being watched, though her eyes often flicked back to him with a tender ache. When Jacob had finished nearly everything, he leaned back in his chair, his expression both satisfied and weary. Margaret finally sat across from him again, folding her hands neatly. "You said your name was Jacob. Do you live close by?" she asked gently. His gaze flickered with uncertainty before he answered. "Yes, with my mom and sister." His voice cracked slightly on the word, "mom," and Margaret leaned in. "Your father?" she asked softly, though she already suspected the answer. Jacob shook his head. He left when I was little. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She understood absence. She understood loss. Bit by bit, Jacob shared fragments of his story, each piece falling like a stone into Margaret's heart. His mother, he explained, had lost her job at a factory several months earlier. Since then, money had been scarce. They sometimes went without electricity, and food was often stretched thin. Jacob admitted he sometimes skipped meals so his younger sister could eat. His voice carried no self-pity, only a quiet matter-of-factness that revealed just how much weight he carried for a child his age. Margaret listened, her chest aching, recognizing in him both resilience and fragility that no child should bear. She sat in silence for a moment after he finished, struggling to contain her emotions. Henry had always believed in fate, that certain people crossed paths for reasons beyond comprehension. Margaret had dismissed it as romantic nonsense, but now, looking at Jacob, she wondered if Henry had been right all along. The resemblance between them was uncanny, but even beyond that, there was something in Jacob's spirit, his quiet strength, his endurance, that mirrored Henry. Margaret reached across the table again and squeezed Jacob's hand gently. "You're very brave," she whispered. His eyes lifted, surprised by her words, as though unused to praise. That evening, after Jacob left to return home, Margaret sat alone in her parlor, staring at the photograph of Henry as a boy. The similarity was staggering, the same sharp jawline, the same dimpled cheek, even the same haunted look in the eyes. She felt a strange certainty settle over her, as though Henry himself had guided Jacob to her fence. For years she had prayed for something to fill the emptiness in her life, and now here was a boy who needed her as much as she needed him. It was both overwhelming and comforting, as though life had conspired to heal her. In the days that followed, Jacob returned. At first, he appeared cautiously, hovering near the fence until Margaret invited him in. She never pressed him with too many questions, respecting the trust he was slowly offering her. Instead, she welcomed him with warmth, food, and gentle conversation. She began cooking again, meals she hadn't prepared since Henry's passing, stews simmering on the stove, pies cooling on the counter. She even found herself humming while she worked, a habit she thought she had buried with her grief. Jacob would sit at the table, watching her with quiet curiosity, his presence softening the air in the house. Over time, Jacob brought his little sister, Lily, a girl with wide brown eyes and tangled hair. Margaret welcomed her with equal warmth, delighted to see both children laughing in her kitchen. She watched them chase each other through her garden, their laughter ringing like music against the backdrop of her roses. Neighbors began to notice, too. "It's good to see children around that house again," they would comment, their voices tinged with approval. Margaret smiled politely, though inside, she felt something far deeper. For the first time in years, her house no longer echoed with emptiness, it pulsed with life again. Margaret soon visited their mother, a tired woman named Anna, whose worn face carried years of struggle. At first Anna was wary, uncomfortable with her children spending time at a stranger's home. But when Margaret extended a hand of friendship and explained her intentions, Anna's eyes softened with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," Anna said quietly. Margaret shook her head. "You don't need to. Sometimes people come into our lives for a reason." Anna smiled weakly, perhaps too exhausted to question it further. From that day on, an unspoken bond formed, rooted in necessity, trust, and compassion. Weeks turned into months, and the relationship deepened. Margaret helped Jacob and Lily with their schoolwork, teaching them at her kitchen table with patience and care. She read them stories at night when Anna worked late shifts at a diner she had finally secured. On weekends, she took them to the park, where Jacob would push Lily on the swings, his laughter ringing freely in a way Margaret had never heard before. She cherished those moments, capturing them like treasures in her heart. Slowly, the widow who once lived in silence began to live again, her days filled with warmth and purpose. The community soon took notice. At church, people whispered about the widow and the children who now followed her into the pew. At the grocery store, neighbors marveled at how she smiled more easily, her eyes no longer weighed down by grief. Some even remarked how uncanny the resemblance was between Jacob and Henry's boyhood portraits, though Margaret never voiced her thoughts aloud. To her, the truth was personal, sacred, something that could not be explained in ordinary words. Henry lived on in Jacob, not through blood, but through the mysterious hand of fate that had led the boy to her fence. Despite the joy Jacob and Lily brought, Margaret knew their struggles were not magically solved. Anna still worked long hours to keep food on the table, and bills still piled up. Margaret, however, quietly stepped in where she could, never wanting to offend Anna's pride. She paid for groceries, offered warm clothes, and even set aside funds for the children's education. Anna resisted at first, but Margaret's sincerity eventually dissolved her hesitations. "You're like family," Anna admitted one evening, tears in her eyes. Margaret squeezed her hand gently, her heart swelling. "That's exactly what we are," she replied softly, meaning every word. Through all of this, Jacob grew closer to Margaret in a way that felt destined. He began confiding in her, telling her stories of school, his dreams of becoming an artist, even his fears of not being enough for his family. Margaret listened patiently, offering encouragement and wisdom Henry once gave her. She marveled at his resilience, at how a boy so young could carry so much responsibility yet still hold on to hope. In Jacob, she saw not just the reflection of Henry's face but the continuation of Henry's spirit, the same quiet strength, the same unwavering sense of duty to those he loved. One winter night, as snow blanketed the town, Jacob and Lily stayed at Margaret's house while Anna worked a double shift. Margaret tucked them into the guest bedroom, reading them a story by the fire. As she closed the book, Jacob looked up at her, his voice soft. "Do you think people who die can still watch over us?" he asked. The question pierced her heart. She brushed his hair back gently, her eyes glistening. "Yes," she whispered, "I believe they can." Jacob nodded, comforted. "Then maybe your husband sent me here," he said simply. Margaret's breath caught. She believed it too. Years later, people in Fairfield would often remark on the remarkable bond between the widow and the boy who wasn't her grandson but loved her as though she were his grandmother. They would speak of how her house transformed from a place of silence to a home filled with joy. Margaret never married again, but she didn't need to. Through Jacob, Lily, and Anna, she had found a family she never thought possible. And every time Jacob smiled, with that same crooked grin Henry once had, Margaret felt her husband's presence reminding her that love never dies, it only changes form. As she grew older, Margaret often sat in her rose garden once again, but no longer alone. Jacob, now taller and stronger, often joined her, helping her tend to the flowers. Together, they planted new bushes, the garden expanding with vibrant colors each year. She would sometimes catch him staring at the horizon with that same thoughtful look Henry once wore, and it would fill her with peace. The boy who once stood starving at her fence had become part of her life's greatest blessing. Fate had written a story she could never have imagined, and she cherished every word of it.